Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through another episode of Independent Thought. So, for my guest this week, I am joined by Will Sutherland, who is a graduate student at Montana State University. Will, thank you for coming on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is, the subject I had you come on to talk with me about today is not something that I typically get to talk about a whole lot on this podcast, but definitely interested in talking about nuclear power today. So, I know that you did some research at the University of Montana in this field. Can you just tell us a little bit about what exactly you did at the University of Montana in regards to researching the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess in order to kind of fully describe my research, I probably need a little bit of background. Um, for for nuclear energy, basically, you need to well, for nuclear fusion research, a lot of the fuel, a lot of the particles that you're working with are at super high energies, so they're too hot to confine with any material that we know of, essentially. So in order to confine these particles, basically you do it with magnetic fields. So my research was in designing and optimizing a magnetic field, essentially, that would confine these extremely hot charged particles, basically a plasma, that would, yeah, basically confine these particles, for research into nuclear fusion, essentially.
So, I've heard about nuclear power before, and I've heard these terms nuclear fusion, nuclear fission. What exactly is the difference between the two, and which one were you like working on at the university?
So all of my research was focused on nuclear fusion. The difference, which I think a lot of people don't recognize the difference. With fission, you're essentially splitting an atom. So you're splitting a much heavier atom into lighter atoms and getting energy as one of the byproducts of that. With fusion, you're basically fusing two lighter atoms into a heavier atom. One of the most common types of fusion that's being researched is the deuterium-tritium fusion reaction, which is basically combining, well, it's heavy water, essentially. So it's isotopes of hydrogen. It's essentially hydrogen with an extra neutron and then hydrogen with two extra neutrons, and you basically fuse those to make a helium nucleus and an additional neutron, which will be extremely high energy. So that's basically fusion in a nutshell. Yeah, so I mean, the short version, I guess, would be fission is splitting a heavy atom into two lighter atoms, and fusion is combining two lighter atoms into a heavier atom and getting
Okay.
energy as a result.
Okay. So when you were trying to like develop these magnetic fields that you were saying, like what was the primary focus of this research? Like were you trying to like understand something or were you trying to like achieve something? Like what was the process exactly?
So essentially, it is just improving. I mean, people who are working on fusion have basically understood the concept for a long time. So it's not really trying to understand the concept. It's basically trying to improve our current practices. So my research was focused around. So we were collaborating with physicists at the University of Wisconsin. They have what's called the helically symmetric experiment there. It's basically a small, uh, basically a small fusion reactor like device, and they were potentially planning on building an upgraded version of that. So my work was on optimizing the magnetic field that would be created by this stellarator is one term for it, for this helically symmetric experiment. So I'd be optimizing the magnetic field. Basically, we had access to supercomputers at the National Energy Research Scientific Computing Center. And through that, we can basically, write a bunch of scripts, write some code, and attempt to optimize or find the best configuration of this magnetic field that will contain these extremely high energy particles for the longest time. In order to, that's basically one of the primary factors in making nuclear fusion efficient, is the confinement time. So basically my goal was to find the optimal magnetic configuration that would confine these high pressure, high energy particles for the longest time possible.
Right. So I think for the normal, like, like average person who's not entirely like entrenched in this field, when we hear the phrase nuclear power, a lot of people either think of one of two things. You've heard of, potential for great amounts of energy, or you think, like radioactive byproducts and being a potentially like an ecological disaster. We think of people who think about Fukushima and other places like that. Could you just tell me a little bit about like the differences, I guess, between like fusion and fission one more time, and how they and the radioactive byproducts that come with them? Like, is fusion safe? Is fission safe? Tell me a little bit what you know about it.
So I think a lot of the misconceptions there are due to most people's familiarity with nuclear power in general. When somebody thinks nuclear power, I think generally they think of fission, because that's what we've had for the past 60 years. So that being said, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that get attributed to nuclear power in general because of nuclear fission. So when I talk about the word nuclear, essentially all we're talking about is the nucleus. That's where the term comes from. So nuclear fission is the splitting of the atom. Nuclear fusion is fusing two lighter atoms. And when it comes to fission, the biggest problem with fission is the radioactive byproducts. You're dealing with like uranium-235, which has a half-life of, I don't know it offhand, it's several million years. So basically, it'd take, I think the half-life's about 7 million years. So it'd take about 7 million years for half of that uranium to basically degrade into something less radioactive. On the other hand, with nuclear fusion, there is very few radioactive byproducts. I mean, your initial fuel, I mean, there's several different ways you can do it, but one of the most efficient ways to do it is the deuterium-tritium reaction, which I mentioned previously. So deuterium is really just heavy water. Tritium is radioactive, but it only has a half-life of about 12 years. So compared to the half-life of uranium, which is, on the order of several million years, it's, basically negligible at that point. And then when you combine the deuterium and tritium, you're left with helium, which is just, an inert non-radioactive gas, and neutrons, which are also, it's just a particle which is non-radioactive. So that is the main, I mean, that's kind of why, that's why fusion is essentially the holy grail of energy, because I mean, deuterium and tritium are your fuel sources, which are plentiful. We would basically, if we had, many operating nuclear fusion reactors, we could power those reactors for thousands of years without ever being concerned about enough fuel. So there's that, and the fact that there's no radioactive byproducts, which makes, like I said, fusion essentially the holy grail of power.
Well, you just stole my next question from me, but that's all right. I was about to ask you. So you're saying that with enough, I guess, like resources behind this, we wouldn't need another energy source. Is that fair to say, or would there still be some gaps in our energy requirements? I mean, just not even just nationally, but globally.
So I mean, at the end of the day, it all does boil down to how much money do we want to plug into nuclear fusion research and into these reactors. I mean, with enough resources, you could, in theory, build enough reactors to power the entire planet. Like I said, the fuel sources are plentiful. So if you have, if you have enough reactors, we've got the fuel already. So that's really all it comes down to. Practically speaking, though, that's probably not realistic, just because the funding hasn't been there, and I don't anticipate it being there in the near future, anyways. So.
Right. So my next question around that is, if this has such a potential upside, like why isn't there like a better source of funding? You said that you were working with some physicists at the University of Wisconsin, but it seems like there really isn't that many places in our country that are even like doing research into nuclear fusion. Like, what exactly are the current restrictions, like politically and technically speaking? Like, why aren't we seeing more resources thrown behind this?
Well, so I mean, I think part of it is, well, I guess just for starters, just to get an idea of how much funding they are getting. Let me check my notes here real quick. Yeah, so basically the U.S. government is spending about $450 million on nuclear fusion annually. So compared to the U.S. military budget, which is $725 billion annually, so we can see that the funding is not substantial there. And as far as why it's not getting the funding, it probably boils down to a couple things. One of which is, I think there's just not incentive for clean energy. We don't, it's just not incentivized to have clean energy. I mean, right now we're too comfortable, using fossil fuels, essentially. But if clean energy was made a priority, then this could become, a very, very large portion of our energy resources, essentially. So, I think part of it is just that there isn't a need right now for, there isn't an immediate need, or at least it's not deemed an immediate need to have nuclear energy or nuclear fusion right now. I guess the contrast to that is we figured out nuclear fission back, in the 40s essentially because we wanted to, create a bomb out of it. So a lot of our funding, some of the best scientists in the world were brought in, and they basically had unlimited funding to figure out nuclear fission. In this case, there's not quite that same incentive to figure out nuclear fusion. And then I think one of the other factors is essentially the difficulty in doing it. We've been trying to to have efficient nuclear fusion for, probably 60 years now. And we've certainly made steps in the right direction, but it's been 60 years and we're still not, the best fusion reactors are only producing about 67% of the energy that you actually put into them right now. So it's, coming out a net negative. So I think that's maybe demoralizing right now. And that might be one of the reasons that it's not getting the funding or the attention that I think that it deserves.
Yeah. And that's kind of like how I want to close this out is, you probably could have taken on a number of subjects when you went to school as far as what it is that you wanted to study. Why has this subject kind of like captured your attention? Like why is nuclear energy where you decided to put your energy, more or less?
Well, I think it just boils down to the desire to do something that will be beneficial towards people. And as far as what I think would help, our society in general, a source of clean energy is about another source of clean energy is about, one of the most important things I think I could work on. So if I could be part of a team or be part of a project that, pushed us in that direction, that'd be, yeah, I could be happy with myself at the end of the day at that point, I think.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really do appreciate it. Is there any place that people can reach out to you if they want to ask you questions about nuclear power?
Yeah, absolutely. My personal email address is probably the best, and that's will.sutherland11@gmail.com. So that's probably the best place to reach me.
Okay. And I'll have that as a link in the episode description for those who are interested. And again, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. And for everyone else, we will be right back after some final thoughts, after this final break with my final thoughts of the day. Stay tuned.
Thank you.